Hi everybody. So as I say, my name is Tom Gidlow and I am a master's student here at the University of Sheffield. I study something called public humanities. Now, a couple of years ago, I made a decision to do something that the average British citizen tries to avoid on a daily basis. And that's that I decided to spend more time in Birmingham than was absolutely necessary. So, I was researching some of the larger political shifts of the early 20th century, so the early 1900s. And I was diving between archives here at the University of Sheffield and at the University of Birmingham. And it was here that I found the story of the life of Louise Fisher. And it's her story that I would like to share with you today. So Louise, despite her seemingly average origins, changed the way that I thought about politics and so many other things. She was born in Chester in 1915 to your average middle to lower income family. And she went on to study at college English and history. And she dreamed one day that she would go on to study at Royal Holloway University. For the meantime though, she trained as a teacher and moved to Birmingham. Now Louise had always had a kind of vague interest in politics, a vague desire to change something. But when she moved to the big city, she was confronted by the reality of harsh government cuts, of huge unemployment, of low quality slum housing, and what she saw as the gross mishandling by the government of the international situation. And what had started as a vague interest in politics became a fiery passion to do something about it and to challenge the situation as it was. And in order to do that, Louise joined one of the more upstart groups of the 1930s. And she was by no means on her own when she was trying to get more engaged in politics. This was a time in the 1930s where the Wall Street crash was beginning to hit the United Kingdom and we were seeing social conditions plummet. It was also a time when democracy was new for groups like women and the working class, God forbid. So at this point, thousands of people, just like Louise, were beginning to get more and more engaged in politics and trying to change the system as they saw it. And it wasn't just Louise and these thousands of other people. There was one man in particular called Samuel Irvine. Now, Samuel Irvine was a truck driver from Kent, and he moved up to Birmingham and joined the same group as Louise had. Now, Samuel was strong and impassioned and confident. He was an articulate orator and he cared deeply about the cause that Louise did. And obviously it wasn't long before Louise Fisher became Louise Irvine. Now, the 1930s brought mixed successes for the pairing. Louise, as a scholar of English, believed that she could change the world and change people's opinions through reading. And she volunteered in a bookshop trying to distribute the literature that she thought would help change the situation as it was. Samuel, as the articulate orator, would conduct weekly street meetings in Birmingham where he would bring his message to the people of the city. And it wasn't always popular. In fact, Samuel often received physical and verbal threats and abuse while he was doing that. Now, it's not to say that Samuel was by any means an angel. So one of the things he used to do aside from street meetings was to paint political slogans on his house, which is all well and good, but the police and the council were less keen when he started doing it on other people's houses. Didn't go down as well, and he was fined for that quite heavily in 1938. And as the 1930s progressed and the couple began to continue their fight against the injustices that they saw, war began to appear on the horizon. Now, neither Louise nor Samuel wanted to see another war with Germany, and they began to campaign, additionally to everything they were already campaigning on, for peace with Germany and peace in Europe. And this was obviously quite a popular opinion at the time, and the ranks of their group swelled massively at this point. But, as we all know, in 1939, the Second World War did break out. And the political positions that both Samuel and Louise had taken during the 1930s became deeply unpopular with the British state. In June of 1940, Samuel was arrested and he's put on a train to Liverpool. There he awaited a ferry that would take him across the Isle of Man. He spent the rest of the war in an internment camp designed for political prisoners. Louise herself, in November of 1940, received a knock at her door. She saw two plainclothes policemen there who promptly arrested her and sent her to jail. And all of a sudden, the woman that had once dreamed of going to Royal Holloway University found herself in Holloway prison. And the power of the British state kept this couple separate for the entire duration of the war. And you're probably wondering how something like that can happen and how you've not heard about it before. And the reason is because I'm kind of not being 100% honest with you. Sorry. Because Louise and Samuel and the thousands of others hadn't dedicated their life and their 1930s to just any political group. Louise and Samuel had joined the British Union of Fascists. Now, to give this a little bit of a context, I'm going to have to bring you back to 1932. So 1932 was the year that Sir Oswald Mosley founded his British Union of Fascists. And it's important to remember that this was a time when fascism didn't have the automatic and rightful taint that it has now. Mussolini had only just come to power. Hitler was not yet Führer. We hadn't seen the Second World War. We hadn't seen the Holocaust. Fascism was just another political doctrine that had started amongst the time when there was a lot of political doctrines starting. Oswald Mosley described his movement in 1933 as a new and revolutionary concept of politics, of economics, and of life itself. Now, for a country that's seeing huge government cuts, massive unemployment, low quality housing, and a gross mishandling of the international situation, a new and revolutionary concept of politics, of economics, and of life itself began to sound quite attractive to a lot of people. And, obviously, with the help of the Daily Mail, the British Union of Fascists, at its peak, reached a membership of over 50,000 people, 2,000 of which joined in the branch that Louise and Samuel had joined themselves in 1936. And 1936 was a very important year for the fascist movement as a whole in Britain. Because before then, all the anti-Semitism that was grounded in that movement had always been spoken about in coded language and in euphemism. There was talk of backroom deals and the international financial conspiracy. But 1936 changed all this. 1936 was the year that the British Union of Fascists started to be openly anti-Semitic. And among other things, this was one of the things that weirdly attracted some people to the movement. Samuel Irvine, during his street meetings, which is one of the more preferred methods of the BUF for communication, would preach what we'd now call hate speech. And the political slogans that he wrote on his and others' houses were also hate speech. And in her bookshop, Louise always made sure that copies of Mein Kampf were easy to buy, along with the fascist newspaper, The Black Shirt, which at its peak had a circulation of over 22,500 every single week. And all of this was, at the time, defended under the idea of free speech. And most of the way through the 1930s, the British Union of Fascists, especially in Birmingham, had maintained really quite good relationships with the police. It wasn't until 1940, a year into the war, when the government released Defence Regulation 18B, which, amongst other things, quelled the fascist movement in the UK, did people like Samuel and Louise find themselves in prison. Now, it's been a few years since I was darting between the archives of Birmingham and here in Sheffield, and a few years since I was really starting to flesh out the details of the story that was Louise's life. And I was kind of a little bit frustrated because her story just seemed to really, really abruptly end in 1940 with her arrest. And for ages, I couldn't find anything. And then one day, here in the University of Sheffield, I found a cassette, which as a 22-year-old was really, really confusing. But eventually, I did work out how to use the thing. Now you're feeling old. I did eventually work out how to use the thing, and it was an interview that Louise had done in 1991, decades later. And amongst other things that she was asked what finally drew her away from fascism, what finally drew her away from Oswald Mosley's creed. And she answered that she never was. She answered that she just never stopped believing in it. She believed right up until her death a few years later that Oswald Mosley and his predictions were right, and they either all had come true or were all going to come true. It was weird because kind of before this, I'd always thought of fascists and people like that as evil people sitting in evil rooms pushing evil buttons. You know the type. But they weren't. They were school teachers from Chester, and they were truck drivers from Kent. And I'll always say that the most terrifying thing I ever learned about fascism was the humanity behind Louise's hatred. Thank you.